This forgotten hero, once properly saved, brought about revival just about wherever he went. Oh God, I wish I could do that. I wish those people watching this could do that. Bring revival wherever we go, Lord. His name, William Haslam. Haslam was born in Sumatra in 1818, and he went to Durham University and then was going to be ordained and was going to be married. But unfortunately, he received a telegram telling him that his fiancée was dying. And he was so grieved by this that he got really ill, and he got an infection of the lung and nearly died. But on recovering, he got ordained. And even though in those days he was more about ordinance and rites than he was about the Bible and Jesus, he went to a parish in Cornwall on the instructions of his doctor so that he could recover his health. He was in that parish for 5 years, and then he was moved nearby here to Baldu. There was no church here and there was no vicarage. And so he designed and built both. And this is the vicarage where we're at today. So he settled here to teach more about morality than salvation. And he would read out his sermons. He never prepared a sermon of his own. He always read out other people's. He wanted to do good for the people because he loved them, but he didn't know how. And then he heard that his gardener had got saved. And this really upset him because he thought he was being deceived. And then in 1851, his gardener got very sick. So Haslam paid him a visit to comfort him, but to tell him that he was deceived about being saved. Not exactly what you want to hear when you're lying on your sickbed. But the gardener's response to him was, "But parson, you're not saved." And this really upset Haslam. So he was fortunate. He had nearby another revivalist, Robert Aitken. And so he went to see him to tell him all his woes and to hopefully receive comfort. But Aitken told him the same thing the gardener did. Haslam, you're not saved. Aitken spoke to Haslam for several hours about Holy Spirit. And as a result, Haslam had a very restless night. And in fact, the next 3 days, he was wrestling with the whole subject of salvation. That Sunday, he was going to come to his church here and close it down until he had found salvation. And he stood up and was just giving out a notice about the day's reading, and he was then going to close the service, but he felt a light come into him, and he felt joy, and he found salvation. And a man, a visiting preacher who was in the congregation of 300 or 400 in this church, stood up and shouted, "The parson's converted, the parson's converted." And everybody got up and shouted and screamed, and when the whole melee had died down, 20 people were crying out to Jesus for mercy. Revival had arrived and would remain for the next 3 years. The next day, a neighbouring vicar came to try and persuade Haslam out of his madness. And when he realised he wasn't getting anywhere with him, he turned to go, and he said he would oppose him in every way he could. And he said, "Let God stop the man who's wrong." And that I think a week later, 2 weeks later, he had a vessel burst in his neck and he was unable to preach again. There was a lot of opposition to Haslam from mainly the clergy and the local gentry. And so he wasn't allowed to preach in other churches. In fact, the vicars would speak against him and warn their people not to attend his services. So he was made to preach outside, like John Wesley did. And he had thousands coming to hear him preach. And he brought revival to several areas. With the coming revival, there are going to be ministers who are going to oppose it, and we must be prepared for that. For all his successes, Haslam wasn't happy because he found so many of the people who'd given their lives to Jesus fell back into their old ways. And so he prayed and he cried out to God, asking for the answer. And he then realized that it was about sanctification. And as he sought God, he had an encounter with him, which I believe was the baptism of fire. And he received sanctification and got a revelation of it, which he began to preach wherever he went. In 1857, Haslam moved from here to Hale in Cornwall. This parish was a rough one, and Hale was spiritually dead. But as usual, through his ministry, revival came. And after he'd been there a while, he walked down one of the main streets and he saw lights on everywhere with sounds of people praising God or praying coming from each of the houses. Quite a change. At the end of his 3-year contract, the whole neighbourhood was alive. But the rector would not renew his contract because he didn't want revival. And he said to Haslam, "These new converts are not churchmen." So Haslam then went to Bath and started an inner city evangelistic work, and it was hard work for him, and his health played up again. He was never completely well after his original illness. So he went on a couple of holidays, but if he expected rest, he was not going to get it, because wherever he went, there was revival. 3 years later, in 1862, he came here to 2 parishes with just 25 houses between them. Here in Hassingham and half a mile away, Buckingham. And he arrived here and he said to the Lord, "Lord, how can you use me here?" And the first Sunday, revival began. And it went on for the 8 years that he was here. Again, he had opposition from the clergy and particularly their wives. And then when his wife started to preach, the opposition became even stronger. And he had a letter from one of the wives, one of the clergy wives, that said, "I've been praying for years for revival to come here, but if this is what it looks like, I can't thank God for it." From here, he went to London to the well-known Curzon Street Chapel, and he was there for a few years, and then he went and became an itinerant minister. But all the time, revival was at the centre of what he was doing. William Haslam died in 1905 at the age of 86. Haslam was a revivalist down to his boots. He persevered despite constant opposition from the church, and we must learn from that. We must also learn that if our leaders are against revival, we must follow Holy Spirit and be involved in any move of God that comes our way.